Hello, I'm Paul Quinn from the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fictions with an important Christmas message. Christmas is not just about Santa, it's about scares as well. I'm going to encourage everyone to indulge in that great tradition of the ghost story or the horror story for Christmas. Not something obvious about killers coming in through your back door and slaughtering your family, although I am in my badly lit conservatory that looks like a crime scene. No, I'm talking about the more traditional horror stories. M.R. James and his ghost stories, or E. Nesbit's horror stories. For those of you who've never come across Nesbit's earlier works before she turned to children's literature, these are Jamesian in their use of suggestion, slow creeping dread, and then that final revelation of something nasty in the house or in the church or in the crypt, or wherever the type of Jamesian academic comes. Priest has gone looking for ancient treasure or some type of academic search which leads to disaster. These are the cold, sticky scares that used to enthrall people during the 60s and 70s with the BBC's long-running adaptations of James. They're there on YouTube and other unscrupulous copyright-breaching sites. You can find Michael Hordenby terrified by that thing in the bed in "Oh, Whistle and I'll Come to You," or The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, which I showed some of my students the last week of term. They really weren't sure what to make of it, and then that slimy thing comes out of the cellar wall to engulf the cleric who's looking for the gold. And then at the end, with that ambiguous ending, is there a monk there, or is it something else, or is it just in the man's mind? And if you're on YouTube and you're looking for something to scare you or something to unsettle you, maybe you might want to look at something else that emerges in the 1970s, that great high point for the BBC making horror stories for Christmas. This is by a former BBC writer. This is Nigel Neal, who gave us the Quakermass serials in the 1950s and the great, terrifying adaptation of 1984, which caused someone's death in 1954. But after that, and after he left the BBC, Neil goes to ATV, where he writes a series of one-off dramas, some of which are horror or unsettling tales, picking up some of the themes that he has in the Stone Tape in the 70s before he goes off to ATV. And so you might, if you're on YouTube, want to look up Murren from 1975, which Neil writes for ATV, which sees a newly arrived vet in a rural community confronted by the suspicion that an illness in local pigs is the work of a local woman who's believed to be a witch. A child from the village who'd had contact with the woman is also suffering from an illness similar to that afflicting the pigs. Locals have cut the woman's cat, which they believe to be her familiar, in half and thrown it over her wall. The television play climaxes with a mob of locals attempting to storm the woman's cottage. Her sudden appearance to confront this mob results in the death of the leader of the group of enraged locals, played by Bernard Lee, of course, the original M in the James Bond series. And he dies. Heart attack, curse. Neil retains the mystery. Murren is shot like a folk horror and is reminiscent of scenes in Terry Nation's Survivors. Murren, which of course is a blight, is an unsettling piece with corn dollies and severed cats, an Anelian clash between the rational and the potentially supernatural. For those of you who know Neil's Quakermass and the Pit, he explains the devil and recurrent images of horns in creatures, mythological creatures, by the revelation that mankind is descended from Martians, and that the horned creatures were their Martian overlords. So Neil has this strain in some of his work of explaining the inexplicable, giving rational explanations for the supernatural. But in these ATV plays, he leaves it unclear whether something supernatural has happened. We can see this engagement with features of folk belief in Baby, the most noted of Neil's individual playlists, Beasts from 1976. Baby sees another vet, this time played by Simon McCorkindale, and his pregnant wife, played by Joan Wymark, moving to the country. They're renovating their cottage, and these renovations uncover a sealed jar containing an unidentified creature, this kind of beastly thing that seems to be part animal and maybe part human. The local builders suggest it's a witch's familiar. On a side note, there were mummified cats found in the walls of a pub in Hastings, and the explanation was that they too were witches' familiars. But back to Neil. Jane Wymark's character becomes increasingly concerned. Play suggests perhaps paranoid, excuse me, that there's something evil in the house. And in the play's climax, the witch, a grotesque creature that's barely recognizable as human, seems to appear in a rocking chair, suckling the grotesque familiar. Jane Wymark collapses to the ground. The camera pans round to an empty chair, albeit one that's still rocking. Again, Neil has the clash between the urbane, scientific figure and rural, supernatural belief, and a lack of explanation. But at its heart, this play is about the constant fear of Jane Wymark that, having experienced one miscarriage, she may miscarry again. And this theme of miscarriages is skillfully intertwined throughout this tale of the uncanny, the supernatural, the inexplicable. Look at the skill if you watch the play, which Neil keeps returning to the idea of miscarriages in animals, associated with the cottage and the surrounding land, and the statement that the creature in the jar was never born. It's also a pitiless portrait of a marriage in trouble. There's constant arguments between McCorkindale and Wymark, and T.P. McKenna, the magnificent actor that we see across British television throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s, turning up in things as disparate as this, Callan, Doctor Who, Blake Seven, as this urbane, avuncular senior vet. He doesn't help the imminent collapse of this marriage. So there's something very serious going on in this play, alongside this spectacle of potential horror. The other notable play in the Beast series is During Barty's Party, which sees another warring couple confronted by their home being attacked by rats. They become trapped in their home. We never see the rats. It's all done with sound. It's very, very skillfully done. The concern with the rats going for the eyes within the play is a superb callback to 1984, which, of course, Neil, as I've said, had already adapted. And we think about the end of that play, Winston Smith confronted with his worst horror, the fear of rats. And then in that great moment of betrayal, tells them to do it to Julia. The rats are here as a threat to this couple. The couple are still alive at the end of the play, unlike their neighbours. But we know they're doomed, just as their neighbours have died. It feels like a Hammer House of horror for those of you who know that series, with maybe some hints of Tales of the Unexpected. It's an influential series, even though many people haven't heard of it or seen it. It remains a favourite of Russell T Davies, Mark Gatiss, and we can see that influence in certainly Gatiss when he was working on The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. We can maybe see it in Shearsmith and Pemberbrooke's Inside Number 9. But that's just some suggestions for you if you do want a traditional scare for Christmas. Beasts, so Baby, During Barty's Party, or the old reliables of M.R. James's Ghost Stories for Christmas, either from the great run in the 60s or 70s, or you might even be able to find the more recent ones, the more recent remakes that have appeared on BBC Two and BBC Four. So pull the curtains, turn down the lights, maybe turn down the heating so it feels more like it's the Victorian period or the 1970s. Read the book, read a story, put on one of the ghost stories on the telly, and you might, if you're lucky, just feel something brushing against the back of your neck. And it might be Santa, or it might be some Jamesian creature, all fingernails, bones, and long hair, and maybe slime. And as Shaw Taylor used to say, don't have nightmares, but maybe in this instance do, as it's part of the Christmas tradition. Thank you.